The shortest verse in the English Bible contains 2 words: Jesus wept. Most people have heard those words. Many have said them aloud, in Sunday school, in sermons, in quiet moments when they needed to believe that heaven was not made of stone. Some people have had those 2 words tattooed on their skin. Others have quoted them at funerals as a form of comfort, as small evidence that the divine is capable of something the human chest feels when it cannot hold its grief anymore. And most people, if they have thought carefully about it at all, assume that this was the moment Jesus cried hardest, the most famous tear, the deepest grief. The Greek disagrees completely, because here is what almost no sermon ever explains. The Bible records Jesus weeping not once but 3 times, 3 distinct moments, spread across the Gospels and the letters of the New Testament. 3 different contexts, 3 completely different Greek verbs, each one describing a different intensity of grief, a different physical expression, a different emotional landscape. English translations collapse all 3 into the same word: wept. It is an understandable translation choice. It is also a catastrophic one. When you flatten 3 distinct Greek verbs into one English word, you do not simply lose vocabulary. You lose the emotional biography of Jesus. You lose the difference between a tear that falls silently down a cheek and a sound that stops a crowd in its tracks with discomfort. You lose the difference between grief that is held with quiet dignity and grief that has nowhere left to go. You lose the difference between weeping and sobbing, between sobbing and screaming. 3 times Jesus cried. Each time, the New Testament authors chose a different Greek word to describe it. Each word reveals something the others cannot, and taken together, these 3 moments contain the most complete portrait of the human interior of Jesus anywhere in Scripture. We are going to examine all 3. We are going to go slowly because the Greek deserves slowness. We're going to sit with each word long enough for it to open into something wider than the translation most of us grew up with. And somewhere between moment 1 and moment 3, I think you will begin to see that the distance between these 3 kinds of crying, the silent tear, the public sob, the anguished scream, is exactly the distance between a God who watches from outside and a God who chooses to enter. There is a detail in moment 3 that most preachers never reach. It lives in Hebrews chapter 5, in a description of what happened in the garden the night before the crucifixion. And once you see it, you will understand something about Palm Sunday, and something about Gethsemane, and something about the cross itself that no single passage makes clear on its own. By the time we reach it, 2 words will carry more weight than they ever have before. Jesus wept. Let's begin. The year is approximately 30 AD. The village of Bethany sits on the eastern slope of the Mount of Olives, 2 miles from Jerusalem, close enough to smell the city on a clear morning, close enough that when the wind shifts, you can hear the temple courts. This is where the sisters live. You know their names. One of them is the kind of woman who moves through grief the way she moves through everything, practically directly, with a knot in her throat and something urgent to say. The other is the kind who sits, who waits, who falls at feet. Their brother, a man named Lazarus, has been dead for 4 days. 4 days is significant, not as a scriptural number. There is no law of Moses governing 4 days and death. But in the popular religious imagination of first-century Judaism, there was a widespread belief that the soul lingered near the body for 3 days after death, reluctant to leave. It hovered in the threshold between the living and the dead, tethered to the flesh by something like hope. On the 4th day, that tether broke, the soul departed, the body began its visible dissolution. The face of the person you loved became something you could no longer look at directly. 4 days meant he is truly gone. There is no ambiguity left. He is not sleeping. He is not in some liminal state between breath and no breath. He is dead in the fullest, most irreversible sense of that word. The sisters had sent word before he died. The message they sent carries a particular grammar, not a request, not a demand, but a statement of bare fact. The one you love is sick. They did not say, "Come now." They trusted that love, once named, would move. And Jesus, the Gospel of John tells us explicitly, stayed where he was for 2 more days after receiving that message. John is careful to explain why. Not because he was indifferent, not because he was busy, but because he loved them. Because the delay was itself an act of love. Though the sisters, sitting with a dying man and then a dead one, had no way of knowing that. File that detail. We will return to it. By the time Jesus arrives outside Bethany, a crowd has gathered. John notes that many Jews from Jerusalem, the city 2 miles away, had come to mourn with the sisters. Professional mourning in the ancient world was not the quiet, private affair most modern Westerners associate with grief. It was communal, vocal, physically expressed. There was wailing. There were hired mourners in some households. There was tearing of garments, covering of heads, sitting on the ground. Grief was not contained to the interior. It was made visible, audible, present in the air of the house and the street outside. When one sister hears that Jesus is approaching, she leaves the house immediately. She does not wait. She goes out before he even enters the village. And she says to him the sentence that is going to echo one more time, a few verses later, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." Notice what she does not say. She does not say, "Why didn't you come?" She does not accuse. She makes a statement of belief, a statement of faith, even in the middle of grief, that is also, quietly, a grief of its own. The gap between what you believed would happen and what actually happened. Jesus has a conversation with her about resurrection. There is theology exchanged. There is a famous statement, "I am the resurrection and the life," spoken in the dust outside Bethany, 2 miles from the temple, to a woman whose eyes are swollen from crying. John records it as a proclamation. It is also, if you read carefully, a form of comfort directed at a specific person in a specific moment of unbearable loss. The other sister has stayed in the house, but then someone goes and tells her, "The teacher is here and is calling for you." She gets up quickly. The Greek word is takeos, immediately, urgently, and goes to him. And she says exactly what her sister said. "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." 2 women. Same sentence, different moment, different tone. John gives you both of them. When Jesus sees the second sister weeping, and sees the crowd of Jews weeping with her, the text says he was deeply moved in his spirit and troubled. The Greek word for deeply moved is embrimaomai. It is an unusual word. In classical Greek, it was sometimes used to describe the snorting of horses, a sound that comes from deep inside the chest, a controlled force being released. When applied to humans, it carried connotations of strong emotion pressing up against constraint. Some translators have suggested it contains something like anger. Not anger at the sisters, but perhaps anger at death itself, at the tyranny of the tomb, at what this world had become. Troubled is ēdakrysen. He stirred himself. He was disturbed inwardly. The same root word appears when the disciples see Jesus walking on water and are terrified. Their world has been shaken loose from what it should be. Then Jesus asks a question that has always struck me as unnecessary, if you think about it theologically. He asks, "Where have you laid him?" He is about to raise this man from the dead. He knows this. He has told his disciples that Lazarus is dead, and they are going to Bethany, so that he can be wakened. He is not asking because he doesn't know where the tomb is. He is asking in order to be taken there, in order to walk to the tomb with the people who loved Lazarus, to stand in front of it, to be present to what death looks like from the outside. They say, "Come and see," and the Greek word for see there is not the ordinary word for looking. It is a word that implies comprehension, perceiving, understanding, being present to something with your full attention. Come and understand. Then John chapter 11, verse 35, ἐδάκρυσεν ho Jesus. Jesus wept. The verb is ἐδάκρυσεν, from the root dakrion, meaning a tear. Not the act of crying in the broad sense, but specifically the physical object, a tear, a drop of moisture, a thing that forms in the eye and falls. Thayer's Greek lexicon distinguishes this verb carefully from the other Greek verbs for weeping and crying. Edakrysen denotes quiet weeping, silent weeping, the kind where tears appear without announcement, no heaving shoulders, no broken voice, no sound that draws attention from across the room. You would not know a person was crying unless you looked closely at their face. Read that verse again. Slowly. Tears. Silent. On the face of someone who is standing outside a tomb that he's about to empty. Jesus already knows what is about to happen. He told his disciples before they left, "Lazarus is dead, and for your sake I am glad I was not there, so that you may believe." He is not surprised by the tomb. He is not uncertain about the next 5 minutes of history. Within moments of standing here with tears tracking down his face, he will call out in a loud voice, and a dead man will walk out of a sealed stone cave wearing his burial cloths. And still, he weeps. Why? This question has occupied theologians for 2,000 years, and the answers, if you sit with them long enough, are more unsettling than comforting. Augustine suggested the tears were apologetic, a demonstration of genuine human emotion to a crowd that might otherwise doubt the reality of his full humanity. Look, he weeps. He is one of us. Thomas Aquinas offered a different reading, that Jesus wept not for Lazarus, who was, as Aquinas put it, about to be fine, but out of compassion for the grief of the sisters. He wept because they were weeping, and love, when it encounters grief it cannot immediately remove, sometimes expresses itself in the same language. But here is what nobody talks about. There is a third reading, one that lives in a detail almost nobody mentions in a sermon. When Jesus asks where Lazarus has been laid, and they say, "Come and see," the Greek word for see there is a word that implies comprehension, perceiving, being present to something with your full attention. What if Jesus, fully divine, yes, but also fully human, the one who grew tired at wells and fell asleep on boats and whose back ached on long journeys, what if, in that moment, standing in front of a sealed stone tomb in the afternoon heat of Bethany, he felt the full weight of what death was? Not abstractly, not theologically, but sensorially, the smell of dust and stone in the heat, the sound of professional mourners in the background, the specific and irreducible absence of a person who had been in this world and was now not in it. What if the tears were the body's response to something the mind already knew, but the human flesh still had to absorb? There is a theology that sometimes presents Jesus as somehow above the difficulty of grief, as though divinity functioned as a kind of emotional shock absorber, cushioning the impact of what the body experienced. But that is not what the Incarnation promises. The Incarnation promises the opposite. It says he became fully human, which means he cried at funerals. The grief arrived, even when he knew how the story ended, even when he was the one who would end it. The crowd has two reactions to his tears. Some of them say, "See how he loved him," and others say, and this is the sentence that cuts, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying? If you loved him, why did you let this happen?" It is the oldest human response to grief in the presence of God. It is the same question that has been asked in every generation since Adam. In every language humans have found for loss, and John does not give Jesus a response to it. The text does not record an answer. He does not turn to the accusers and explain the logic of the delay. He simply groans again, embryomai, from deep in the chest, and he walks to the tomb. He calls out, "Lazarus, come out," and Lazarus comes out. John chapter 11 is the longest build-up to a miracle in the entire Gospel of John. And the shortest verse in that entire build-up, 2 words in English, 3 in Greek, does the most theological work of all. Edakrysen is not the loudest word in this story. It is, arguably, the most intimate. A silence before the miracle. Tears before the shout. The God who knew the ending, choosing to feel the middle. Now consider what happens next. The scene at Bethany is 6 days behind us. Lazarus walked out of the tomb. The burial cloths were unwound. The sisters held their brother's face, and the crowd reacted, as crowds always react to the inexplicable, with division. Some believed. Some ran immediately to the Pharisees to report what had happened. That second group matters more than it might seem. In John's Gospel, the raising of Lazarus is not simply a miracle. It is the precipitating event for the Sanhedrin's decision to have Jesus killed. The text says this explicitly. From that day on, they planned to put him to death. A man who could empty tombs was a threat that had to be answered, which means the tears at Bethany, those quiet, silent, ədakrysen tears, set something in motion that the weeping itself could not have fully anticipated. Or perhaps it could. Perhaps the groaning that preceded the tears, that embryomai sound from deep in the chest, was not only grief for Lazarus and the sisters, but some knowledge pressing up from inside about what this act of love was about to cost. 6 days after the miracle at Bethany, Jesus rides into Jerusalem on a donkey. The city turns out to meet him. People cut palm branches and wave them in the air. They spread their cloaks on the road. They shout the word that Psalm 118 gave them, "Hosanna, save us now." The crowd that had witnessed the raising of Lazarus is there, and they are telling anyone who will listen. This is the man who called a dead man out of a cave. Every painting of the triumphal entry you have ever seen shows Jesus at the center, receiving the acclaim, moving through the crowd with something approaching joy. And perhaps there was joy. The emotions of this week are not reducible to a single note, but Luke chapter 19 tells us something that the paintings almost never show, and the word Luke uses is not edakrysen. To understand why this moment is so different from Bethany, you need to understand what Jerusalem meant, not what it means to us 2,000 years later, filtered through crusades and pilgrimages and church history and modern geopolitics, what it meant to a first-century Jewish man riding down the Mount of Olives in the spring. Jerusalem was not simply a city. It was the place where heaven and earth were said to intersect. The Temple Mount was, in the theological imagination of Second Temple Judaism, the navel of the world, the axis point, the place where the glory of God had chosen to dwell. The prophets had said that one day all nations would stream to this place. The Psalms called it the city of the great king. Every male Jew was obligated to appear before God there 3 times a year. Jerusalem was the dream that kept an exiled and occupied people coherent. It was the symbol and the substance of everything that God had promised and not yet fully given. It was the place where the story was supposed to end in glory. And Jesus, riding toward it, was sobbing, not weeping quietly the way you weep at a grave when you want to stay composed. Not ədakrysen, with its intimacy and its restraint, but eklausen, full, audible, undignified by the standards of his culture. The kind of grief that a grown man in the ancient Mediterranean world was supposed to suppress in public because its expression was culturally associated with women mourning at funerals. He did not suppress it. The word eklausen comes from the root kleo, and it describes not the quiet fall of tears, but audible, public weeping, the kind of crying that makes sound, the kind that cannot be concealed, The same verb appears in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament, for the wailing of women at funerals, for the mourning of Israel in Babylon, for the grief of a mother who has lost her children. When John's Gospel describes Mary Magdalene at the empty tomb on Easter morning, crying, searching, unable to stop, the word used there is the same root. Luke chose that word for Jesus on the road into Jerusalem, not edakrysen, not silent tears, єklausen. He sobbed, he made a sound, the crowd around him could hear it. And here is what nobody asks. What did the crowd do when they heard it? The crowd that had been shouting Hosanna, the crowd waving branches and throwing cloaks on the road and celebrating what they believed was the arrival of the one who would restore the kingdom. They could see his shoulders shaking. They could hear the sound. What happens to a crowd when the person they are celebrating begins to cry? Luke does not tell us. He records the tears, and then he records the words, and then he moves on. But the silence around that detail is worth sitting in. There is a specific geography to this moment that matters. The road descending from the Mount of Olives curves around the southern slope, and at a particular point, a point that pilgrims to Jerusalem can still visit today, the entire city suddenly comes into view. The Temple Mount, the walls, the towers, the density of rooftops descending toward the Kidron Valley. The first-century city would have been gleaming with marble and gold in the spring light. Herod's temple was, by the account of ancient visitors, one of the most magnificent structures in the Roman world. Jesus came around that curve. Jerusalem opened up before him, and he wept. In the Greek, the preposition is epi, over, upon, concerning. This is not incidental. He was not weeping in general, distressed in some unspecified way. He was weeping over this specific thing before him. He was weeping about Jerusalem, about what it was and what it was not, and what was coming. Now hold this alongside Bethany. At Bethany, Jesus wept over one person, one man who had died, one family's grief. In Luke 19, Jesus wept over an entire city, over generations, over the fate of a civilization, over people who were, at that exact moment, celebrating his arrival, and who, in the same moment, were not recognizing what his arrival actually meant. The phrase Luke records, "If only you had known, on this day, the things that make for peace," is in the Greek, what scholars call a second-class conditional. A statement that assumes the condition is not met, that the thing being wished for is not happening. If only you had known. But you do not know. You cannot see it. What they could not see, apparently, was him. They saw a king arriving. They saw the fulfillment of a promise in the shape they had imagined it would take. They saw a political liberator, a military messiah, a man who had raised the dead and surely could defeat the Romans. They waved branches and shouted psalms and threw their best clothes in the road. And the thing hidden from their eyes, in Luke's precise phrase, was the nature of the peace he was actually bringing. Not peace as the absence of Roman occupation. Peace as shalom, the Hebrew concept that is not simply the cessation of conflict, but the full, restored, integral flourishing of everything that has been broken. He was bringing the real thing, and they were celebrating a different thing, and he loved them enough to grieve that gap. This is the detail I think is theologically underexplored. Jesus did not arrive at Jerusalem angry at the crowd for missing the point. He did not arrive with a lecture. He did not begin his entrance into the city with a correction. He wept. He grieved the distance between what he carried and what they could receive. He mourned the collision between his purpose and their expectation, not with frustration, not with condescension, but with the full-bodied, undignified, audible grief of єklausen. And then he said something about 70 AD. He said, "The days will come upon you when your enemies will build an embankment against you and encircle you and hem you in on every side. They will dash you to the ground, you and the children within your walls. They will not leave one stone upon another because you did not recognize the time of God's coming to you." Within 40 years of that moment, every word of it would come true. In 70 AD, the Roman general Titus would besiege Jerusalem, breach its walls, destroy the temple, not leaving one stone upon another, and kill or enslave the population. Josephus, the first-century Jewish historian, records approximately 1 million dead. Jesus, weeping on a donkey on Palm Sunday, was describing this in real time. There is a version of Jesus in popular Christian imagination that is serene, composed, a man who moved through human chaos with a kind of calm that transcended the difficulty of being human. And there are passages that support that portrait, moments of extraordinary stillness, sayings of such lucid peace that they have sustained human beings through every possible form of suffering for 2,000 years. But Luke chapter 19 is not that passage. Luke chapter 19 is a man on a donkey, surrounded by a crowd that loves him, sobbing over a city that is going to kill him because he can see what they cannot see, and the gap between his vision and their blindness is not a thing that theology can cauterize. It can only be felt. "Ēklausen," he cried out loud, in public, on Palm Sunday, while people threw flowers at his feet. That detail is somehow never on the Palm Sunday bulletin. And yet it is the one that might tell us the most about what Palm Sunday actually was. And then there is the third time, the one most people don't even count. The reason most people don't count it is that it appears not in the Gospels, but in the Epistle to the Hebrews. And it is not described as a scene. There is no Mount of Olives, no tomb outside Bethany, no specific chapter and verse to visualize. It is a statement, a theological claim embedded in an argument about the nature of priesthood. Hebrews chapter 5, verse 7. Let me read it slowly. During the days of Jesus' life on earth, he offered up prayers and petitions with loud cries and tears to the one who could save him from death, and he was heard because of his reverent submission. Prayers and petitions with loud cries and tears. The Greek phrase is meta kraugēs, ἰσχυράς kai edakrysen, with strong outcries and tears. Kraugē ισχυρά, strong cry, loud cry, forceful outcry. This is not edakrysen, the single silent tear of John 11. This is not even eklausen, the sobbing of Luke 19. This is the word the book of Revelation uses for the cry of souls under the altar. How long, O Lord? This is the word used for the shouts of crowds. This is the word used for the noise of anguished screaming, strong outcries, with tears. This is what Hebrews says Jesus offered in prayer. Now the question every scholar wrestles with, when? Hebrews doesn't give a timestamp, but the surrounding passage, its discussion of the priestly role, of suffering as the mechanism of obedience, of being made perfect through what one endures, points to the period immediately before the crucifixion. Most particularly the garden, Gethsemane. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all record the garden scene, and all three record that Jesus prayed there with extraordinary intensity. Matthew says he was deeply distressed and troubled, the Greek ademonian, which carries the sense of being bewildered, almost panicked, and that he told the disciples his soul was overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. He fell on his face. He prayed that if it were possible, the cup might be taken from him. The Synoptic Gospels describe a man in extremity. Hebrews chapter 5 tells us that extremity included loud cries and tears, strong outcries. And here is what stops me every time. We have sanitized Gethsemane into something manageable. In most paintings of the garden scene, Jesus kneels in golden light, hands folded, face tilted toward heaven in a posture of beautiful surrender. The disciples sleep quietly in the background. There is moonlight. There is a kind of dignity to the scene. Grief, yes, but composed grief, contained grief. Hebrews says, strong outcries, kraugēs ｉschyrās. This is not a composed man kneeling in golden light. This is a man whose voice was loud enough to carry beyond the garden. The Greek word is the same word used for the cry of a crowd, for the desperate shout of a person who needs to be heard, for the noise of anguish pressed past the point where it can be silent. And he was heard because of his reverent submission, Hebrews says. Not because the prayer was elegant, not because the suffering was dignified, because the one offering it was submitted to the one receiving it, even in the middle of making a sound that carried across the garden in the dark. Luke chapter 22, verse 43, a verse present in some early manuscripts and absent from others, records that an angel appeared to Jesus in the garden and strengthened him. And then Luke adds something that Matthew and Mark do not, that his sweat became like drops of blood falling to the ground. 3 early manuscripts omit this verse entirely, which raises its own question about why someone might have wanted to remove it. If the verse is authentic, it describes a physiological response. Hematidrosis, the rupturing of capillaries near sweat glands under conditions of extreme psychological stress, that the human body can produce in moments of acute anguish. It is rare, it is documented, and it means that in Luke's account, the body of Jesus in Gethsemane was under a level of psychological pressure that produced a measurable physical response. Strong outcries, tears, blood like sweat in the dark. This was not serenity. This was a man at the absolute outer edge of what the human body and soul can sustain. And Hebrews says he prayed with all of it, the crying and the shouting and whatever the garden did to his body and his face and his voice. He offered it as prayer. To understand why Hebrews considers this significant, why the loud cries are not a theological embarrassment but a priestly qualification, you need the verse that immediately precedes verse 7. Verse 6. Although he was a son, he learned obedience from what he suffered. He learned obedience. Past tense. Through the experience of suffering, there was something that Jesus came to know that he could not have known before, or could not have known in the full-bodied, embodied sense that only suffering produces. And then verse 7, he prayed with loud cries and tears, and he was heard. The theology here is radical, and most preachers rush past it. What Hebrews is saying is that the loud cries and tears were not a breakdown. They were not a failure of faith or composure or trust. They were the prayer. The crying was the prayer. The strong outcries offered to the one who could save him from death were heard, not despite the noise and the tears, but through them. The God who could save him from death heard the screaming. And the answer was not what the screaming was asking for. He was not saved from death. He went to the cross, which raises a question the text actually invites rather than avoids. What does it mean to be heard if the thing you are praying for does not happen? Hebrews chapter 5 does not answer that question directly. What it says is, he was heard because of his reverent submission. The Greek word translated as reverent submission is eulabeia, a compound word meaning literally good grasping, careful taking, the posture of someone who handles something holy with great attention and care. Not fearful, not servile, but careful, attentive, present to what was being given even while expressing everything that resisted it. He prayed for the cup to be taken. The cup was not taken, and he was heard. What it means to be heard by God is not necessarily what it means to receive the specific answer you were screaming for. Hebrews is making a claim that is more terrifying and more comforting than that the loud cries themselves, offered in reverent submission, constituted an encounter, that the screaming entered somewhere, that the tears were received. This is the least domesticated of the 3 moments of weeping. Edakrysen, the silent tear at Bethany, is intimate and tender. It is grief in the presence of a specific loss, quiet enough to miss if you are not looking closely at his face. It has been preached 10,000 times, and it still moves people. Eklausen, the sobbing on Palm Sunday, is public and undignified and rarely discussed precisely because it is uncomfortable. A man of sorrows, acquainted with grief, sobbing on a donkey while a crowd cheers. Kraugēs Ισχυράς, the strong outcries in the garden, is neither intimate nor public. It is anguish in its most extreme register. The full pressure of human fear and human grief and human dread of death, pressed against the only thing that could have answered it. These three Greek words, placed side by side, describe something that no systematic theology quite captures on its own. They describe a God who moved through grief in stages, who cried quietly at a grave, who sobbed publicly over a city, who screamed alone in a garden in the dark, and then went to the cross. But here is the detail that changes everything about this story. We have been looking at three moments of weeping in roughly chronological order, John 11, Luke 19, Hebrews 5, and it is tempting to read them as a narrative arc that builds toward the cross and resolves there. As though Gethsemane was the emotional climax, after which some peace was made, some divine composure reassembled. Most depictions of the crucifixion encourage this reading. Jesus on the cross is typically shown as gaunt and suffering, yes, but also elevated, above the crowd, above the ground, in a posture that carries, despite everything, a quality of transcendence. It is finished, complete. But Hebrews chapter 5 places the loud cries and tears before the crucifixion. During the days of his life on earth, verse 7 says, not on the cross but before it, in the garden, while the disciples slept, while the arrest party was still making its way across the Kidron Valley with torches and weapons, which means Jesus walked into the trial exhausted from weeping. He stood before Pilate having already spent himself emotionally. He carried the cross, having already been to the outer edge of what a human body can sustain under psychological pressure. He arrived at Golgotha with his eyes already swollen, and still he went. This is the thing the three Greek words, taken together, allow us to see that no single verse can show alone. He was not stoic on the way to the cross. He was not above it emotionally. He did not arrive there in some elevated state of spiritual composure that insulated him from the full human weight of what was happening. He arrived at the cross already having wept, already having sobbed, already having screamed, and the cross happened anyway. There is a theology of the cross that emphasizes divine control, the sense that because Jesus knew the outcome, the suffering was somehow mitigated, managed, less than fully felt, that the resurrection was in his pocket the whole time, and knowing it was there kept the cross from being truly terrible. Three Greek words argue otherwise: edakrysen, eklausen, kraugēs Ισχυράς, silent tears, loud sobs, screaming in the dark. This is not a man managing his suffering from a distance. This is a man who entered it all the way down, who allowed grief to be grief without deflecting it, who cried over one person and then cried over a whole city and then screamed alone in a garden and then, having done all of that, stood up, went to meet the people who were coming for him and said, "I am he. I want you to hold that for a moment." The three moments of weeping form a progression, not only in emotional intensity, but in scope. At Bethany, Jesus wept over one person, one family, one specific death in one specific village on one specific afternoon. On Palm Sunday, Jesus wept over one city, one generation, one civilization moving toward a catastrophe it could not see coming. In Hebrews chapter 5, in the garden, in Gethsemane, in the dark, Jesus prayed with strong outcries over what most scholars understand to be the full weight of the cup, everything, the entirety of what humanity had done to itself and to each other and to God, compressed into a single act of absorption. One person, one city, all of it. The emotional geography of the three Greek words maps a kind of descent into the full breadth of human grief, from the particular to the universal. From one man's death to an entire generation's blindness, to something that cannot be named except through the strongest word in the Greek vocabulary for crying. What Hebrews chapter 5 is saying, in its careful, priestly, theological way, is that the one who wept at Bethany and wept over Jerusalem had the right to carry the weight of everything into the garden precisely because he had not skipped the smaller griefs on the way there. He arrived at the widest grief having already been broken by the narrow ones. He was qualified to intercede because he had wept, because he had known in the flesh what it costs to love something mortal. Because edakrysen and eklausen and kraugēs ἰσχυράς were not three separate moments. They were one continuous act of love expressed in three different intensities across three different contexts. And the high priest who entered the Holy of Holies in the theology of Hebrews was the same man who stood outside a tomb 2 miles from Jerusalem with tears on his face, not knowing, in the human part of himself, whether the tears made any difference at all. They made all the difference. We have been in 3 places: Bethany on a late afternoon that smelled of stone and dry earth, where a man stood outside his friend's tomb and shed tears silently, and then called out in a voice that ended death for an afternoon. The road descending the Mount of Olives, where a man on a donkey sobbed over a city that was cheering for him, because he could see past the cheering into something the crowd could not yet feel coming. A garden in the dark, where a man pressed his voice toward heaven and prayed with loud cries and tears, and was heard, not by receiving what he asked for, but by being met in the middle of the asking. 3 moments, 3 Greek words, 3 different textures of grief, existing in the same person across a single week of history. Edakrysen, silent, intimate. The kind of grief that requires proximity to notice, eklausen, audible, public. The kind of grief that cannot be hidden, even from a crowd that would rather not see it. Kraugēs, ｉschyrās, loud outcries. The kind of grief that becomes prayer when it has nowhere else to go. Most of us, if we live long enough and love deeply enough, will know all 3. There will be a moment in front of a grave where you cry quietly, and nobody knows unless they look closely at your face. There will be a moment when grief is loud and you cannot contain it, and you are not sure it is appropriate to be this undignified. There will be a night in a garden, metaphorically or literally, when what you have left to offer is a sound, offered to whatever you believe is listening. And somewhere in the middle of all 3 of those moments, if this text is true, there is a figure who has already been there, who has already used all 3 words, who arrived at the cross with swollen eyes and kept going. That is everything the Bible tells us about the times Jesus wept. 2 words in English, 3 Greek verbs, 3 moments across one impossible week, and somehow that's enough. If this opened something for you, share it with someone who needs it. Subscribe, we'll be here. Scripture Uncharted, every story the church forgot to tell.